At 7:12 a.m., Claire Maddox sent her mother a short message. She had reached the start of the trail. The sky was perfect. She would be back on Sunday. For her family, this was supposed to be a routine check-in. Everything was fine. She was there. The plan was on track. But Claire did not return. At first, she was searched for as a missing hiker, then as someone who might have died in the mountains. They found her car, they found her keys. Later, they found one trekking pole among the rocks, but they did not find her backpack, her GPS communicator, her body, or an answer to the main question, what happened after she entered the forest? And only months later would it become clear that the most terrible mistake was in the very premise of the investigation. Claire did not simply disappear in the wilderness. Perhaps she should not have been searched for among the rocks and trees, but much closer to human habitation. If you're interested in stories where every little detail could be the key, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your theories in the comments. Let's begin.
The morning of Friday, September 14, 2018, arrived over Glacier County the way all early autumn mornings do in that part of Montana. Slow, gray, and heavy, with the smell of pine resin and coming rain. By 6:45 a.m., the temperature at the Browning weather station read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. A thin ground fog had settled across the lower meadows east of the Two Medicine River, clinging to the brown grass in long, translucent ribbons. Somewhere above the tree line, a pair of Clark's nutcrackers argued over a pine cone they couldn't share. Everything was ordinary. Everything was exactly as it always was on a Friday morning in September in the foothills east of Glacier National Park. Elaine Patricia Rourke was 33 years old. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall, with dark auburn hair she typically wore pulled back in a low braid, green-gray eyes that her mother, Dorothea Rourke, later described to investigators as the color of a lake just before it rains, and a faint scar on her left forearm from a childhood bicycle accident on a gravel road outside Missoula. She had a habit of touching that scar when she was thinking, pressing 2 fingers to the pale ridge of it, as if reading Braille. People who knew her well could tell when she was working through a problem not by her expression, which rarely changed, but by that small, private gesture. She had lived in Cut Bank, Montana for the past 4 years, renting the upper floor of a 2-story wood frame house on West Central Avenue from a retired school teacher named Howard Belknap, 71, who lived downstairs and whose hearing aid sat most days on his kitchen counter rather than in his ears. Elaine worked as a field ethnobotanist for a nonprofit organization called the High Plains Botanical Conservancy, which maintained a research office in a converted garage space on the edge of town. Her work took her into the field 3 or 4 days a week between late spring and mid-autumn, and she had developed, over 4 seasons, an intimate familiarity with the terrain between Cut Bank and the eastern boundary of Glacier National Park, the coulees, the creek drainages, the unmarked 2 tracks that branched off County Road 464 like capillaries from a vein. She was, by all accounts, methodical, organized to a degree that some of her colleagues found mildly unnerving. Her field notebooks, spiral-bound, college-ruled, purchased in bulk from the Office Depot in Great Falls, were filled with dense, precise handwriting in black ballpoint. Each entry dated, timed, GPS coordinated, each plant specimen tagged and cross-referenced. Her supervisor, Dr. Caroline Wexler, 48, a tenure-track botanist from Montana State who oversaw the Conservancy's field operations, would later tell investigators that Elaine was the most reliable field researcher I have ever worked with in 22 years of this work. If Elaine said she would be somewhere at a certain time, she was there. She did not make errors. The evening before she disappeared, Thursday the 13th, Elaine had eaten dinner at the home of her friend and neighbor Patrice Hollowell, 40, a county road maintenance supervisor who lived 3 blocks away on Cascade Street. The dinner was spaghetti bolognese. Patrice later remembered that Elaine had brought a bottle of moderately priced Cabernet Sauvignon and had drunk 1 glass over the course of the entire evening. They had watched 40 minutes of a nature documentary about migratory birds before Elaine said she needed to be up early. She had hugged Patrice at the door. Not a perfunctory hug, Patrice emphasized, but a real one, the kind where you actually feel the other person's weight. She smelled like cedar soap, Patrice would say, 7 months later, in a voice that had been worn smooth by repetition. I remember that very clearly. Cedar soap. At 9:22 p.m. on September 13th, Elaine sent a text message to Dr. Wexler. The message read, heading out to the Two Medicine drainage tomorrow a.m., checking the gooseberry stands at the upper survey site, back by 3 at the latest. We'll upload field notes Friday night. Dr. Wexler replied with a thumbs-up emoji at 9:31 p.m. This was the last outgoing communication Elaine Rourke ever made from a personal device. At 6:15 a.m. on Friday the 14th, her landlord, Howard Belknap, heard footsteps overhead. Her characteristic unhurried, measured stride moving from the bedroom to the kitchen and back, and then the sound of the exterior staircase on the north side of the house, each wooden step announcing her departure in its familiar sequence. He did not look out his window. He turned back to his coffee and his newspaper. He would spend the next year replaying that decision. Her vehicle, a 2014 silver Toyota Tacoma with 94,000 miles on it, was recorded by a traffic camera at the intersection of U.S. Highway 2 and Route 49 at 6:52 a.m., traveling south toward Two Medicine. The image was clear enough to read the first 3 digits of her license plate. She was alone in the vehicle. From the junction of Route 49, she would have driven approximately 14 miles south to the Two Medicine area entry road, then continued past the Two Medicine campground, which was closed for the season, its gate rolled back and padlocked, along the maintenance track that follows the east shore of Two Medicine Lake. Her upper survey site, designated HS7 in Conservancy records, was located in a gully approximately 2.5 miles northeast of the lake's eastern terminus, at an elevation of roughly 5,400 feet. She had visited this site 11 times since spring. The walk from the end of the drivable track to S7 took, at Elaine's pace, approximately 45 minutes. Her pack that morning weighed by the Conservancy's own equipment log just under 18 pounds. It contained a handheld Jeeps unit, 2 1-liter water bottles, a first aid kit, a folding trowel, collection envelopes, a hand lens, her field notebook, a half-eaten protein bar from the previous week, her phone in its orange silicone case, and a waterproof jacket tied to the exterior frame. There was no emergency beacon in her pack. The Conservancy did not require them for day trips. At 7:44 a.m., her Tacoma was found the following day still parked in its usual position at the end of the Two Medicine maintenance track, engine cold, doors locked, keys on the dashboard hook where she always left them when she was in the field. Her orange water bottle was on the passenger seat, still 2/3 full. Her phone was not in the vehicle. Her Jeep's unit was not in the vehicle. Her field notebook was not in the vehicle. She had taken all of them with her, exactly as she always did. She had not left a note. There was no reason she would have. She was coming back. At 3:14 p.m. on Friday, September 14, 2018, Dr. Caroline Wexler sent Elaine a text message. Field notes when you get a chance. The message showed as delivered. It was never read. At 5:45 p.m., Dr. Wexler called. The phone rang 9 times and went to voicemail. She left a message in a tone still casual, still professionally measured, the tone of a person who does not yet know she is frightened. She would call 3 more times before dark. By the 4th call, the tone was different. At 8:20 p.m., Dr. Wexler called the Glacier County Sheriff's Office and reported Elaine Rourke as overdue. The dispatcher, a 26-year-old named Trina Hess, who had worked the evening shift for 2 years and had logged dozens of overdue hiker calls, later noted in her incident record that the caller's voice was controlled but elevated in pitch, consistent with suppressed distress. Hess took down the information calmly, told Dr. Wexler that a deputy would be sent to the trailhead and that search resources would be assessed in the morning if the subject had not returned on her own. Elaine Rourke had been in the mountains for 13.5 hours. The temperature at the Two Medicine Valley floor was dropping through 34 degrees. Above 5,000 feet, it was already below freezing. The sky to the northwest carried clouds dense enough to hide the mountains entirely. She had been to that site 11 times. She knew the terrain. She had packed for a 6-hour trip. Somewhere up in the dark, among the frost-stiffened gooseberry canes and the gray limestone ridges, the last person who knew exactly where Elaine Rourke was Elaine Rourke herself, and she was already gone. The first deputy to reach the Two Medicine maintenance track was Kyle Matson, 31, a third-generation Glacier County resident who had grown up hunting elk in this exact drainage and knew the terrain well enough to navigate it without a map. He arrived at 9:47 p.m. on September 14th, confirmed the silver Tacoma, confirmed it was locked, confirmed the orange water bottle on the seat, and radioed back to dispatch. His field notation read, "Vehicle present, no subject, night temps critical, requesting SAR activation for first light." The Glacier County Search and Rescue Team, 17 volunteers with a combined experience of over 200 backcountry operations, was placed on standby at 10:15 p.m. Their operations coordinator, a 44-year-old retired firefighter named Don Abernethy, received the call while sitting at his kitchen table paying monthly bills. He closed his laptop, put on his boots, and was at the SAR staging area at the 2 Medicine turnoff by 11 p.m. to begin pre-dawn organization. He had done this 79 times before. Each time, he noted later, felt exactly the same as the first. The specific quality of dread that precedes a search when a subject is already hours overdue in cold terrain. At 6 a.m. on Saturday, September 15th, the full SAR team deployed into the 2 Medicine drainage. The weather had deteriorated overnight. A high-pressure system that the National Weather Service had predicted would hold through the weekend had stalled 30 miles to the west, pulling in a band of cold maritime air from the northwest. By the time searchers crossed the lake's eastern terminus, the temperature was 29 degrees, and a sleet that could not quite decide whether to be rain or snow was falling horizontally from a white sky. Wind gusts in the exposed upper drainage exceeded 25 miles per hour. The search was organized into 3 primary sectors. Team Alpha, 6 members including SAR coordinator Abernethy, followed the most direct route to Elaine's designated survey site, HS7. Team Bravo, 5 members, swept the terrain north and east of the track, covering a series of shallow coulees that drained toward the 2 Medicine River. Team Gamma, 4 members, was assigned to the rocky headwall to the south and west, terrain which Elaine had no reason to enter, but which experienced searchers always considered, because experience had taught them that people in distress moved toward perceived shelter rather than away from it, and the headwall's limestone overhangs offered at least the illusion of shelter from wind. A 4th resource arrived at 9:30 a.m., a search dog unit from the Lewis and Clark County Sheriff's Office, consisting of handler deputy Marlene Swick, 37, and a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois named Decker. Marlene Swick wore her dark hair in a functional braid and kept her emotions behind a wall of professional brevity that the Glacier County searchers recognized and respected. Decker was given a scent article, Elaine's orange water bottle, bagged the previous night by Deputy Matson, and released at the Tacoma's driver's side door at 9:42 a.m. Decker immediately moved south along the maintenance track, nose low, tail rising incrementally as the scent cone tightened. He tracked Elaine's path for approximately 1 mile, with consistency that Swick later described in her report as strong and directional. Then, at a point 1 mile and approximately 200 yards south of the Tacoma, at the junction of the maintenance track and a faint use trail that branched eastward toward a section of terrain not included in Elaine's survey route, Decker stopped. He circled the junction 3 times. He sat down, which was his alert signal. Then he stood again, circled again, and moved 12 feet back the way he had come before sitting a second time. In Swick's experience, that behavioral sequence indicated one thing: the scent trail ended or bifurcated in a way that was unclear or had been disrupted. Something at that junction had broken the continuity of Elaine Rourke's passage through the world.
This is where that very moment begins, the one that always feels especially difficult in missing persons investigations. We know where Claire was in the morning, we know what time she texted her mother, we know that she reached the start of the trail, locked her car, hid the keys, and went into the forest. Everything looks absolutely normal. But that's exactly the problem, because after that it's as if the person just drops out of reality. There is an entry point but no exit point. There is a trail but no confirmation that she completed it. There is an experienced researcher who knows how to work alone in the mountains, and then there is silence. In situations like these, rescuers always first consider natural causes: a fall, injury, hypothermia, loss of orientation, or sudden bad weather. And that makes sense. But with Claire, everything is complicated by the fact that she was extremely well prepared, far too attentive to details, and too knowledgeable about how to survive. That's why her disappearance from the very beginning doesn't look like a simple accidental mistake. It looks like deliberate interference with a route that should have been predictable.
Team Alpha reached A7 at 10:20 a.m. The survey site was a rock-floored gully approximately 30 yards wide, flanked by frost-killed gooseberry canes and a stand of mature subalpine fir. The gooseberry canes near the site's permanent reference stakes, metal posts driven into the ground in Elaine's first visit, showed evidence of recent examination. Several canes had been cut cleanly at the base with a folding knife, the Conservancy's standard sampling method, and the cuts were fresh enough that the white wood at the cut surface had not yet darkened with oxidation. The cuts were made within the past 48 hours. Almost certainly on the morning of the 14th, Elaine had been here. She had done her work. She had taken her samples. And then she had not walked back to her truck. A complete ground search of HS7 and a 400-meter radius produced no further sign. No dropped equipment. No footprints in the frozen ground hard enough to hold a clear impression. No clothing. No blood. Don Abernethy stood at the center of the survey gully for 7 minutes without speaking, looking at the cut gooseberry canes, turning the facts over in his mind the way a mechanic turns a stripped bolt, applying pressure from different angles, looking for purchase. "She finished what she came to do," he said finally, to no one in particular. The search continued through the 15th, the 16th, the 17th, and into the following week. Additional resources were requested and received. A fixed-wing aircraft from the Civil Air Patrol flew grid patterns over the drainage on September 16th and 17th. A 4-person team from the Blackfeet Nation's Volunteer Emergency Response Unit joined the effort on September 18th, covering terrain to the northeast that the initial teams had not reached. Elaine's family, her mother Dorothea, 61, a retired librarian from Missoula, and her brother Thomas, 37, who drove up from Billings in his work clothes and didn't go home for 11 days, set up a command presence at the 2 Medicine staging area, sitting in folding camp chairs under a nylon awning, waiting. On the 8th day of the search, September 22nd, at 2:15 p.m., a member of Team Bravo, a 23-year-old university student named Cody Parr, who was on his first active SAR operation, found something in the bottom of a shallow coulee approximately 3/4 of a mile northeast of Decker's Alert Point. It was a single page torn from a spiral-bound notebook, college-ruled, black ballpoint ink. It had been folded 4 times and then apparently unfolded. The crease lines suggested deliberate handling, not random damage. The top line read, in Elaine's precise, slope-forward handwriting, H7, September 14th, 2018, 0844. Ribes velutinum, 3 cut specimens, basal diameter, 4 to 6 millimeters, no significant. The entry ended there, in the middle of the word significant. Not torn, not smudged, simply stopped, as if the pen had been put down and not picked up again. The page was sealed in an evidence bag by Deputy Matson. Forensic examination would later confirm it had been exposed to weather for no more than 72 hours. It had been placed there, not scattered by wind, not dropped in a fall. The fold lines were too deliberate, the placement too centered in a natural drainage channel. Someone had put it there for a reason that no one could yet determine. The note was the only physical evidence recovered in 14 days of active search. The investigation generated 847 pages of field notes, 41 individual witness interviews, and 1 forensic canine report. It generated no answers. On October 2, 2018, the Glacier County Sheriff's Office officially suspended active search operations and reclassified Elaine Rourke's case as a missing persons investigation with no confirmed evidence of foul play. The case was assigned to Detective Sergeant Bonnie Tull, 46, an 18-year department veteran who wore her gray-streaked hair short and kept a photograph of a mountain range she had never identified on her office wall, not as decoration, she once said, but as a reminder that there were always things she couldn't name yet. Thomas Rourke, on the morning the official suspension was announced, walked to the edge of the parking area at the 2 Medicine staging area and stood looking up at the mountains for a long time. He had his hands in the pockets of the same canvas work jacket he had been wearing since the day he drove up from Billings. He did not cry. He did not speak. He stood there for approximately 4 minutes, then turned and walked back to his rental car and drove away. Dorothea Rourke sat under the nylon awning for another hour after everyone else had gone. the awning made a small, flapping noise in the wind. A SAR volunteer, a teenager named Maria Gutierrez, who was collecting the folding chairs, later said she did not know what to say to Dorothea, so she sat down next to her in one of the remaining chairs. They did not speak. They just sat there together in the cold for a little while, listening to the flapping. A missing person case does not close. It accumulates. It gathers the weight of time the way a riverbed gathers silt, invisibly, incrementally, until one day you look down and can no longer see the bottom. By the spring of 2019, the Elaine Rourke case file at the Glacier County Sheriff's Office had grown to 1,100 pages. It had been assigned a case number, 18-CR-4471, that appeared on a row of 3-ring binders on Detective Sergeant Tull's shelf, distinguished from its neighbors by a red flag tab she had placed on the spine. The red flag meant active, follow-up required, do not archive. She checked the binders every Monday morning and every Thursday afternoon. She had no new information. She checked anyway. The Conservancy had replaced Elaine's survey site HS7 with a notation in their database that read, "Field access suspended pending resolution of investigative matter." The site had not been visited since September 2018. The gooseberry canes Elaine had cut for samples had grown new shoots by the following summer, and by the summer of 2020, the cut marks on the parent stems were no longer visible. In Cutbank, the upper floor of Howard Belknap's house on West Central Avenue remained vacant for 14 months. Belknap, when asked by a reporter from the Great Falls Tribune whether he had considered re-renting it, replied that he had not yet gotten around to it. He said it without elaborating. The reporter understood. Howard Belknap was 73 years old and had lived alone for 11 years, and the overhead sound of a measured, unhurried stride moving from bedroom to kitchen had been, for 4 years, the closest thing to company he had. Patrice Hollowell, Elaine's friend from Cascade Street, continued to work for the county road department. She continued to make spaghetti bolognese, though she later admitted that she had not been able to buy the same brand of Cabernet Sauvignon since September of 2018. It was not a dramatic or deliberate choice. She simply could not make herself reach for it on the shelf. Thomas Rourke hired a private investigator in January 2019. The investigator, a retired Missoula police detective named Gregory Stahl, 55, with a permanently skeptical expression that his ex-wife had once described as a face for reading warrant applications, took the case on a reduced retainer because he had a daughter roughly Elaine's age. He spent 4 months re-interviewing witnesses, requesting Jeep cell tower data from Elaine's phone carrier, and cross-referencing sex offender registries for Glacier, Pondera, and Teton counties against any recent changes of address or behavioral flags. He found nothing the initial investigation had not already found. He told Thomas Rourke this in a phone call in May 2019 and said he was returning the unused portion of the retainer. Thomas told him to keep it. The cell phone data, carrier records obtained by Detective Tull in October 2018 via court order, had already told investigators everything the phone could tell them, which was very little. Elaine's iPhone showed its last Jeep's ping at 8:51 a.m. on September 14, 2018, at a coordinate that placed it 340 meters northeast of survey site HS7 at an elevation of approximately 5,520 feet, slightly above the site itself, suggesting she had moved upslope briefly after completing her sampling. After 8:51 a.m., the phone produced no further pings, which meant one of 3 things. The battery died, the phone was destroyed or submerged, or someone with knowledge of cell phone tracking had powered it down and shielded it from signal. A 14-year-old boy named Eli Pratt from Browning, who was an amateur radio operator and had been listening to emergency frequencies on the morning of September 14th from a hilltop east of town, contacted the sheriff's office in November 2018 to report that he had heard a brief, broken transmission on a frequency commonly used by backcountry hikers, 1 short pulse, 2 longer ones, then silence, at approximately 9:30 a.m. He had not thought much of it at the time. Direction finding on that report was attempted and produced nothing useful, but Detective Tull noted it in the file and placed a second red flag tab on the relevant binder section. The public's attention followed its usual arc. The initial disappearance had generated local coverage in the Great Falls Tribune, a brief segment on the Missoula CBS affiliate, and a Facebook group called Find Elaine Rourke, Bring Her Home, that had 2,400 members within a week of her disappearance. By the first anniversary of her disappearance, the Facebook group had 2,390 members. 10 people had left. For whatever private reasons people leave such groups, by the second anniversary, it had 2,210 members and was posting less frequently. By the third, the most recent post before a renewed burst of activity in early 2020 was a generic "We remember you" message from an account with no profile photo, posted at 2:17 a.m., which generated 4 likes. Dorothea Rourke did not join the Facebook group. She kept Elaine's cell phone number active, paying the monthly fee on a separate family plan because she could not decide, had never been able to decide, whether the right word for Elaine was or is. The phone bill arrived each month and she paid it, and she did not think too hard about what she was doing, because if she thought too hard about it, the arithmetic became unbearable. A phone number attached to no one, a monthly fee paid to a carrier that had no idea it was serving as a small, expensive act of refusal to accept the permanent tense. In the autumn of 2020, a retired school teacher from Havre named Felix Drummond, 68, began visiting the 2 Medicine drainage on weekends. He had read about the case in the Tribune and had developed what he described to his wife Nora as an interest. He was not a trained investigator. He was not a survivalist or an experienced backcountry traveler. He was a former high school history teacher with 2 artificial hips and a habit of reading cold case files the way other people read mysteries. He brought a hiking pole, a good camera, and a printed topographic map of the drainage, on which he had marked all the locations referenced in the publicly available search records. Every Sunday that weather allowed, from late September to early November of 2020, he walked a different section of the drainage. He found nothing relevant to the case, but he continued, with the patient, methodical persistence of a man who had spent 30 years teaching young people that the most important historical events are usually not visible until years after they occur. He was the only person, outside of law enforcement and Elaine's immediate family, who was still actively looking. The gooseberry canes at 7 continued to grow. The red flag tabs on Bonnie Tull's binders had faded from red to a dusty orange by the autumn of 2021. She had not replaced them. She thought about replacing them. She thought about a lot of things on Monday mornings and Thursday afternoons that she never had occasion to act on. She had 11 open missing persons files on that shelf. Elaine Rourke's was the oldest. At night, in the kind of thoughts that come in the hour before sleep that no one ever talks about in court, Bonnie Tull sometimes thought about the folded piece of notebook paper in the coulee. She thought about the deliberate crease lines. She thought about a word ending in the middle of itself, no significant, and what exactly it was that Elaine had found there in the frost and the gooseberry canes on a September morning in 2018 that had interrupted her mid-sentence. She had no answer. The question simply sat there in the dark, patient as stone. The call came in on a Tuesday, September 10th, 2019, a date that placed it 4 days before the 1-year anniversary of Elaine Rourke's disappearance. The time was 11:23 a.m. The caller was Felix Drummond. He had been walking a section of the drainage he had not previously covered, a broad shelf of relatively flat terrain approximately 2 miles northeast of A7, bordered to the north by a low ridge of exposed limestone outcroppings, and to the south by a stand of lodgepole pines so dense that even at midday the interior was dim as dusk. He had reached this section by following a game trail that was not marked on any map he possessed, pushing through undergrowth heavy with frost-blackened buffalo berry and wild rose canes that left shallow parallel scratches on the backs of his hands. He had been walking for 4 hours. His artificial hips were aching in the familiar way that reminded him his body had opinions about how he spent his retirement. He almost didn't go to the limestone shelf. The game trail bypassed it to the south, threading through the pine stand, and the shelf itself was accessible only by a short, steep scramble over loose talus. He later said he went up because the limestone outcropping at the top of the talus had an unusual shape, a long, flat-topped formation approximately 12 feet in length and 4 feet across, raised above the surrounding shelf on a natural stone pedestal that made it look, from below, vaguely architectural, like something placed rather than grown. He scrambled up the talus. He reached the shelf. He walked toward the limestone formation. He stopped. He stood absolutely still for what he later estimated was 2 full minutes, though it may have been longer. He could not be certain of the time because he had not looked at his watch, and he did not look at it now, because looking at his watch would have required him to look away from what was in front of him, and he was not capable of looking away. She was lying on the limestone formation, on her back, her arms at her sides, palms up, fingers slightly curled, the posture of absolute rest, of utter surrender to gravity. She was clothed, field trousers, a long-sleeved shirt, both so deteriorated by a year of weather that they had merged in places with the surface beneath her. Her boots were missing. Her face was turned slightly to the right, toward the mountains. She was covered in beeswax, not dripped or splattered, covered. A smooth, consistent application of pale golden amber wax that encased her from the base of her neck to the tops of her feet in a layer that, forensic investigators would later determine, averaged 6 to 8 millimeters in thickness. The wax had the quality of old church candles, slightly translucent in places, opaque in others, yellowed toward the surface, where UV light had reached it, and darkened along the edges where it had pooled in the natural contours of her clothing and body. In the places where it had cracked, from the freeze-thaw cycles of a Montana autumn, winter, and spring, it had the look of very old fresco, the fracture lines following the topography of what lay beneath. Her face was not covered. Her face was exposed, upturned slightly to the sky, eyes closed, lips slightly parted. The skin had the waxy, preserved quality that forensic specialists would later attribute partly to the extreme cold of the Montana winter, partly to the desiccating effect of the high-altitude wind, and partly, only partly, to the protective encasement around her body. Felix Drummond called 911 at 11:23 a.m. His voice, recorded by the Glacier County dispatch system, was entirely steady. He gave his name, his location by Jeep's coordinate, and a factual description of what he had found. He did not use the word body for the first 40 seconds of the call. He used the word person. When the dispatcher asked him to confirm the subject was deceased, there was a pause of 4 seconds before he replied, "Yes, I believe so." He was asked to stay on the line. He sat down on a rock at the edge of the talus, facing away from the limestone shelf, and he held the phone to his ear, and he listened to the dispatcher's voice, and he waited. The wind moved through the lodgepole pines below him with a sound like distant breathing. The first law enforcement officer to reach the scene was Deputy Kyle Matson, the same deputy who had been the first to the parking area on the night of September 14, 2018. He arrived at 1:07 p.m. after a 2.5-hour approach on foot, guided by Jeep's coordinate. He documented the scene with his department-issued camera before touching anything. His first photograph, time-stamped 1:09 p.m., shows the limestone shelf from a distance of approximately 30 feet. The pale, recumbent figure, the amber encasement catching the afternoon light in a way that made the wax almost luminous, the dark pines behind, the gray limestone beneath. It is a photograph that the Glacier County Sheriff's Office would later classify as evidence and restrict from public release for reasons not entirely legal in nature. Some images, it was determined by people who had looked at them longer than they wished to, had the capacity to do harm simply by existing in the world. Detective Sergeant Bonnie Tull arrived at 3:45 p.m. She stood at the edge of the shelf for approximately 90 seconds before putting on her evidence gloves and approaching. She examined the wax encasement without touching it. She noted the uniformity of the application, not the work of a single pore, but of multiple applications built up in layers. She noted that the fracture lines in the wax ran predominantly in directions consistent with thermal expansion and contraction rather than physical impact, which meant the wax had been applied while the body was already in place, here, on this stone. She noted the absence of footwear. She noted the deliberate positioning of the arms. She noted, and this detail would not appear in any public document for 18 months, that beneath the beeswax, visible through a large fracture crack along the subject's left forearm, there was something else, a pattern, straight parallel lines pressed into or through the wax and into the fabric of the sleeve beneath it. She photographed the crack. She photographed the pattern. She tagged the photograph with a note. Linear impressions, left forearm region, possible deliberate marking, pre- or post-wax application. requires specialist examination. The forensic pathologist called to the scene was Dr. Rachel Okafor, 43, from the State Medical Examiner's Office in Missoula, who had driven 4 hours and then walked 2.5 more in the failing afternoon light, arriving at the shelf at 5:50 p.m. She was meticulous and extraordinarily quiet, a quality Tull noticed and found appropriate to the moment. She worked by the light of field lamps for 2 hours, making observations and measurements without disturbing the wax encasement. Her preliminary notes, later incorporated into a formal report running 47 pages, began with the following assessment: subject female, consistent with reported description of Elaine Patricia Rourke, DOB March 11, 1985. Overall state of preservation inconsistent with expected decomposition rate for outdoor exposure in high-altitude Montana environment over 12-month period. Preservation markedly superior to expected. Beeswax encasement is assessed as a significant contributing factor. The formal identification was made 3 days later, on September 13, 2019, one day before the one-year anniversary of Elaine's disappearance, using dental records from her dentist in Great Falls and a DNA comparison sample provided by Dorothea Rourke. Cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. There were no skeletal fractures. There was evidence of prolonged physical restraint in the form of healed and partially healed ligature marks on the wrists and ankles. The determination from the State Medical Examiner's Office would take 6 weeks of detailed analysis to finalize. But even at the scene, in the last of the afternoon light, with the field lamps casting hard shadows across the limestone shelf, Dr. Okafor made one statement, spoken quietly, intended only for Tull, her voice entirely without inflection. She was kept alive for a significant period after her disappearance, weeks, possibly longer. The bone density changes in the forearms are consistent with prolonged, restricted movement. Tull looked at the limestone formation. She looked at the pale figure encased in amber wax, arms at her sides, palms up, face turned toward the mountains in the posture that someone had chosen, deliberately and with apparent care, to arrange her in. She looked at the fracture crack along the left forearm and the straight parallel lines visible beneath it. She thought about a word ending in the middle of itself. No significant. She thought about what Elaine had seen or heard or noticed in the first moments after she put that pen down. "All right," she said. She said it so quietly that only the mountain heard her. "All right, let's find out."
A trekking pole may seem like a very minor clue at first glance. No backpack, no phone, no clothing, no traces of blood, just a single pole wedged between rocks on a scree slope. But in cases like this, it's often the small items that become the most important. Why is that? Because they show exactly where the normal course of events was interrupted or altered. If Claire had fallen, the pole might have been snapped into pieces, bent or thrown aside. If she had misplaced the object by accident, there might have been signs of haste or other belongings in the immediate vicinity. But the pole looks as if it was placed there, as if someone stopped, freed their hand, and then something happened that prevented them from coming back for it. And even more important is what wasn't found nearby: the second pole, the backpack, the tent, the GPS communicator, or any traces of a campsite. In other words, what was found was not the chaos left after an accident, but a single isolated item. And sometimes such emptiness around a piece of evidence speaks louder than the evidence itself.
The investigation that followed Elaine Rourke's discovery moved on 2 tracks simultaneously, and Detective Sergeant Bonnie Tull ran both of them. The first track was the forensic reconstruction of Elaine's last movements, accounting for the gap between 8:51 a.m. on September 14, 2018, when her phone last pinged, and the point at which she had ended up on that limestone shelf 2 miles northeast of her survey site. The second track, beginning within 48 hours of discovery, was the investigation of the beeswax itself. The wax had been submitted to the State Crime Lab in Missoula and to a specialist in forensic apiculture, the scientific analysis of honeybee products for forensic purposes. A professor named Dr. Hank Serrano, 61, from the University of Idaho, who wore bifocals on a lanyard around his neck and had the careful, considering manner of a man who spent a great deal of time thinking about things that moved slowly. Dr. Serrano's analysis of the wax samples, completed over a period of 3 weeks, and delivered in a report that was 42 pages long, and read, in parts, like a deeply unusual piece of nature writing, determined the following. The beeswax was of a type consistent with domestic honeybee production, Apis mellifera, specifically from colonies maintained using Langstroth-style hives, as opposed to wild or feral colonies. It contained pollen signatures, trace botanical material embedded in the wax during normal hive production that were consistent with a high-altitude Montana environment, specifically plant species, characteristic of elevations between 4,500 and 6,000 feet in the Rocky Mountain region east of the Continental Divide. The pollen mix included Ribes velutinum, the same gooseberry species Elaine had been sampling at S7 on the morning of her disappearance. Someone who kept bees at or near elevation in the Two Medicine drainage had applied this wax. The geographic profile built from this finding, combined with the terrain data from Elaine's phone ping and the recovery site coordinates, generated a search radius that Detective Tull, working with a geographic profiler contracted from a private forensic consultancy in Bozeman, centered on a roughly 4-square-mile section of terrain in the northeast quadrant of the drainage. Within that quadrant, county property records identified 12 separate parcels, 9 of them, under active ownership. Of those 9, 3 had structures with confirmed occupancy. One of those structures was a homestead property on a county-maintained access road approximately 3.8 miles from the Two Medicine maintenance track on a 40-acre parcel assessed in the name of a 49-year-old man named Gerald Owen Pruitt. Gerald Pruitt had purchased the property in 2011 for $87,000. County records listed him as a beekeeper and small-scale livestock farmer. He had no criminal record. He had no restraining orders, no documented domestic incidents, no contact with law enforcement of any kind beyond a single speeding citation on Highway 2 in 2014. His neighbors, the Tanner family, who ran a cattle operation 2 miles to the east, described him as quiet, self-sufficient, helpful, in the way of a man who shows up without being asked when there's a fence to be mended or a vehicle stuck in spring mud. His apiary, visible from the county road, consisted of 12 Langstroth hives, arranged in 2 rows along the southeast edge of his property, facing the afternoon sun. They were well maintained. The hive bodies were freshly painted in a pale cream color. He was known at the Browning hardware store, where he bought supplies every few weeks, and at the Cut Bank grocery, where he bought the same modest list of items on the same day each fortnight. The checkout clerk, a woman named Brenda Fall, 53, described him to investigators as no trouble at all, quiet, polite, always said thank you. She said this in the specific, hollow way that people say things about others when they have just realized that they have spent years not seeing them. The warrant for search of the Pruitt property was signed by a Glacier County District Court judge at 7:14 a.m. on October the 22nd, 2019. A 30-person search team assembled at 8 a.m. at the county road junction. Detectives, evidence technicians, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Montana named Dr. Sylvia Crane, 48, who wore a canvas field hat even indoors, as a habit she had never bothered to break, and a 2-person tactical unit from the Glacier County Sheriff's Office as a precautionary presence. The team arrived at the Pruitt property at 8:47 a.m. Gerald Pruitt was not at home. His 2009 Ford F250, dark green, was gone from the gravel pad beside the house. The house was locked. The apiary to the south was quiet in the October morning, the bees in their end-of-season torpor, the pale cream hive bodies casting short shadows in the low autumn light. The house itself was a single-story wood-frame structure, approximately 1,400 square feet, constructed sometime in the 1970s, and maintained with a thoroughness that felt, to the investigators standing before it, almost deliberate, as if cleanliness had been applied not for comfort, but for concealment. The window frames were freshly caulked. The exterior walls had been repainted in the past 2 years. The wood porch steps were sound, their edges planed smooth, the surface grit-sanded for traction. The lawn, the front lawn, the side lawn, was dead for the season, but had clearly been cut with regularity through the summer. The borders neat, the fence line between yard and wildflower meadow a precise, unwavering line. Bonnie Tull stood on that porch for a moment and breathed in the cool air. dried wood, apiary wax, a trace of wood smoke from a fire the previous night, the faint mineral smell of frost-killed grass. Before she nodded to the entry team, the interior of the house presented a surface of complete domestic normalcy. A kitchen with clean counters and organized shelves, a living room with a couch and 2 chairs, a television, a shelf of paperback novels organized by author's last name. On the mantelpiece above the propane fireplace, a framed photograph of a mountain range. Tull looked at it and recognized the east face of the Rockies north of the 2 Medicine Valley, and a smaller framed image of what appeared to be a honeybee, rendered in a style reminiscent of medieval manuscript illustration, wings spread, body thick with detail. The kitchen smelled of coffee, recently made. He had not been gone long. The south bedroom, the one whose window faced the apiary, showed evidence of regular occupancy: a made bed, a small bedside table with a glass of water, and a worn paperback. A closet with folded clothing arranged with the same mechanical precision as the rest of the house. On the bedside table beside the glass and the book was a small jar of raw beeswax. The jar was hand-labeled in neat block printing, rendering, September 2018. The forensic evidence technician, a 39-year-old named Paul Strickland, who had worked crime scenes for 11 years and had developed the particular skill of processing what he saw through a purely procedural filter, bagged the jar and tagged it and moved on. He would say later that he did not allow himself to think, while working, about what September 2018 meant in the context of the case. He allowed himself to think about it only that evening, after he had filed his intake forms, sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the sheriff's office in Browning, not quite ready to drive home. The critical discovery came at 11:20 a.m. Evidence technician Laura Desjardins, 27, methodical, quiet, the kind of person who looks at rooms the way mathematicians look at equations, searching for the element that doesn't resolve, had been working through the north end of the house, which contained a utility room, a bathroom, and what appeared from the interior to be a second closet. The closet door was the same interior door as all the others in the house, hollow core, white painted, with a standard lever handle. She opened it and found coats on hooks, rubber boots on the floor, a shelf of maintenance supplies, standard, expected. She stood in the doorway of the closet for a moment. Then she reached in and pressed her hand flat against the back wall. The back wall moved. It was not a wall, it was a panel, 3/4-inch plywood, painted to match the drywall behind it, mounted on recessed piano hinges that allowed it to swing inward smoothly when pressed at the correct point in the lower right quadrant. The hinges had been oiled. The panel swung without sound. Behind it was a staircase descending into darkness, the air coming up from below carrying a specific combination of smells that would later be cataloged in the evidence report as beeswax, lamp oil, animal bedding, unwashed cloth, and a deeper chemical undertone that Dr. Okafor, reviewing the report, identified as consistent with the kind of prolonged human habitation in an unventilated enclosed space that leaves its chemistry in the walls. The basement was divided into 2 areas. The outer area, approximately 15 by 20 feet, floored with poured concrete, contained a workbench with tools, shelves of wax rendering equipment, a double boiler, molds, filtering cloths, jars, a chest freezer, and a set of wooden shelves that held 47 individual jars of rendered beeswax, each dated and labeled in the same block, printing as the jar on the bedside table. The earliest jar was dated rendering June 2011, the month Pruitt had taken possession of the property. There was no jar dated between rendering September 2018 and rendering May 2019. The gap in the sequence was 8 months. The inner area was separated from the outer by a wall of poured concrete blocks with a steel door, commercial grade, the kind used in walk-in freezers, with a lever handle on the outer side only and a small sliding vent at eye level. The door was not locked. Desjardins called for Tull before opening it. The room behind the steel door was 8 feet by 10 feet. The floor was concrete, overlaid in the center with a pallet covered in layers of folded burlap. The walls were bare concrete except for a single wooden shelf at waist height on which stood a lamp, battery-powered, LED, the kind sold for emergency use, a water container with a spigot, and a ceramic bowl containing dried gooseberries. On the wall beside the shelf scratched directly into the concrete in a pattern that had taken considerable time, and a small, hard instrument to produce, were 387 individual marks, arranged in groups of 5, the classic tally system. The 5th mark crossed diagonally through the other 4. Dr. Crane, the forensic anthropologist, photographed every set of marks and later counted them 3 times to confirm the number. 387 days. 387 days from September 14th, 2018 to October 6th, 2019. The date on which, based on the continuity of the tally, Elaine Rourke had still been alive. The limestone shelf where her body was found was 1.1 miles from the Pruitt property, accessible via a route through the lodgepole pine stand that avoided all county roads and all mapped trails. The forensic pathologist's revised assessment, incorporating the tally evidence, placed time of death no earlier than mid-October 2019, approximately 13 months after the disappearance. Elaine Rourke had not died in September 2018. She had been alive, in this room, on this pallet, counting the days in groups of 5 in the concrete wall, for more than a year. Along the bottom edge of the tally wall, in smaller, tighter scratching, were 7 words. Detective Tull knelt down to read them. The forensic photographer documented them. They read, "My name is Elaine. I was here." Gerald Owen Pruitt was apprehended at 4:35 p.m. the same day at a Flying J truck stop on Interstate 15 north of Great Falls in his dark green Ford F-250 with a full tank of gas and a duffel bag in the bed containing clothing, $4,200 in cash, and a sealed jar of beeswax dated rendering, October 2019. He offered no resistance. He was cuffed and placed in the back of a Cascade County Sheriff's vehicle, and he sat there with his hands in his lap, and he said nothing for 2 hours. He did not ask what the charges were. He did not ask for a lawyer, though he would have one within the hour. He simply sat. The arresting deputy, a 29-year-old named Shane Collier, would say later that the most disturbing thing about the arrest was not Pruitt's silence. It was his expression. He looked, Collier said, searching for the word, like a man who had been waiting for us. Not afraid, not surprised, just waiting, like he'd already finished something and was ready for what came next.
And this is where the story completely changes its genre. Up until this point, you could think it was an accident. The mountains, the weather, that Claire might have slipped, frozen, gotten lost, fallen into a ravine, or ended up somewhere the search team simply didn't reach. But when she is found alive 7 months later, emaciated, silent, with marks of prolonged restraint on her wrists, it becomes clear, all this time, she wasn't a lost tourist. She was a captive. And that changes everything, because now every single old fact starts to sound different. The most terrifying thing here is that Claire was not somewhere in an inaccessible abyss all this time. She was nearby, close enough to roads, houses, and people, yet still out of reach.
The trial of Gerald Owen Pruitt opened on March 3, 2021, in the Glacier County District Court in Cut Bank. The courtroom seated 82 people. On every day of testimony, all 82 seats were filled by 7:30 a.m. Pruitt was charged with first-degree kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and second-degree murder under Montana statute. The prosecution was led by Deputy County Attorney Leanne Ortiz, 38, who had been with the Glacier County Attorney's Office for 7 years and who had the particular quality of composure that comes not from confidence, but from preparation so thorough that it had replaced the need for confidence. Her trial file was 2,800 pages. She had read every page 4 times. The defense was led by appointed public defender Marcus Shields, 45, from Great Falls, a compact, deliberate man who argued effectively and without sentimentality, and who, in the weeks before trial, had visited the Pruitt property twice, walked the route to the limestone shelf once, and sat in the concrete room behind the steel door for 3 minutes, with the door open and the light on, before deciding that there was no framing of the facts that would serve his client, as well as a narrowly focused challenge to the forensic chain of custody. He was a realist. He did his job well within the constraints of what was true. The prosecution's opening case was built on 4 interlocking foundations: the forensic apiculture report establishing the wax origin, the tally marks, an inscribed statement in the concrete room, The jar dated September 2018 found on Pruitt's bedside table, and the testimony of Dr. Rachel Okafor, whose 4-hour examination on the stand covered the cause of death, the evidence of prolonged restraint, and the evidence of the wax application process in a voice so precisely controlled and so completely devoid of theatrical inflection that it became, paradoxically, more devastating than any theatricality could have been. The beeswax encasement, Dr. Okafor testified, was applied after death. The application was consistent with multiple sessions, not a single event. The layering pattern, the distribution of air inclusions, and the thermal cracking patterns all indicate that the encasement was built up over a period of days, possibly a week or more. The process was not rushed. It was careful. Leanne Ortiz paused for 5 seconds after that answer, before asking her next question. The courtroom was silent enough to hear the ventilation system. To what purpose in your professional assessment would such a process serve? Dr. Okafor considered the question for a moment before answering. Preservation, she said. The primary mechanical effect of the encasement was preservation. It significantly retarded decomposition, protected the body from scavengers, and maintained physical integrity for a period far beyond what the outdoor environment would have permitted otherwise. Whether that was the intended purpose is beyond the scope of my forensic determination. On the 11th day of testimony, Gerald Pruitt took the stand in his own defense. He wore a white dress shirt and gray trousers and sat very straight and answered questions in a voice that was quiet and measured and entirely without what the courtroom expected to find in it, which was some explanation, some key that would translate the facts into something comprehensible. He confirmed that he had kept bees since 2009. He confirmed that he had found Elaine Rourke on the morning of September 14, 2018, in distress near his property. He declined, under cross-examination, to elaborate on what in distress meant or how she had come to be on or near his property. He said that he had provided care. He said that he had not intended for her to be harmed. Leanne Ortiz placed a photograph on the display screen. The photograph of the tally wall, 387 marks, the 7 words at the bottom. Mr. Pruitt, she said, does this look like something you provided to someone in your care? He looked at the photograph for a long time. She was not alone, he said finally. She was in a room with a steel door that locked from the outside. She was not alone, he said again. He did not say anything else. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts on the afternoon of March 26, 2021. Pruitt showed no reaction to the reading of the verdict. He sat with his hands folded on the defense table, and he watched the jury foreman, a 57-year-old retired accountant named Doug Hines, who had to clear his throat twice before his voice would come out. And when the third guilty was read, he simply nodded, once, as if confirming something he already knew. He was sentenced on May 14, 2021, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, Judge Catherine Warfield permitted, as is customary in Montana District Court sentencing proceedings, a victim impact statement to be read into the record. Elaine Rourke could not give one. Her mother, Dorothea, 74 years old by then, with white hair and reading glasses on a beaded cord around her neck, stood at the podium in the courtroom and read a statement that was exactly 1 page long. She had written it herself, in longhand, at the kitchen table of her apartment in Missoula, over the course of 3 weeks. She had revised it many times. The final version was composed entirely of factual statements about who Elaine had been, her work, her field notebooks, the cedar soap, the scar from the bicycle accident, the way she touched that scar when she was thinking. Dorothea did not make any claim about justice or its adequacy. She simply described her daughter in the precise, careful language of a woman who had spent 33 years learning every detail of another person and could not let those details be forgotten. When she finished, she folded the page, put it in her coat pocket, and sat down. Thomas Rourke was in the 4th row. He had his hands on his knees, and he was looking at the floor. He did not look up for a long time. The beeswax jars from Pruitt's basement, 47 of them, spanning 2011 to 2019, were retained as evidence and subsequently transferred to the state crime lab, where they remain cataloged in a climate-controlled storage unit. The jar dated September 2018 is stored separately, in a sealed evidence bag with a double chain of custody tag. Dr. Serrano's report, when it was admitted as evidence, ran 42 pages. Most of those pages are science, but the final paragraph, which is not standard practice in forensic science reports, and which Dr. Serrano later said he included because he could not find a category that covered it, reads, "The specimen analyzed represents, to this examiner's knowledge, a use of beeswax, without precedent in any forensic literature I am aware of. The material was applied with a consistency and care that suggests repeated, intentional effort over an extended period. What meaning the subject, the depositor, ascribed to this act I cannot determine from the chemistry, but the chemistry establishes clearly that it was not a casual or spontaneous act. Whatever this was, it was deliberate. It was chosen." In July of 2021, Howard Belknap, 75, finally rented Elaine's apartment on West Central Avenue in Cutbank. The new tenant was a young woman, a graduate student in environmental science at the University of Montana, who had taken a summer research placement with the Conservancy. She had never heard of Elaine Rourke, which was not her fault. She rearranged the furniture and put plants in the window and was, by all accounts from the landlord below, a considerate tenant. Howard Belknap installed new weather stripping on the exterior staircase that winter for the first time in 10 years. It was a practical thing to do. Felix Drummond, the retired school teacher who found Elaine, was called as a witness at trial. He testified for 40 minutes on the morning of March 8, 2021. The weather at the Two Medicine drainage that morning, the condition of the talus slope, the look of the limestone shelf from below and above. He was asked by Ortiz whether he had been afraid when he reached the top of the talus and saw what was there. He considered the question carefully, with the expression of a man who believed that imprecise answers were a form of disrespect. "I was not afraid," he said. "I was very sad. There is a difference." He paused, "and I was glad she was not left up there alone anymore." He returned to Havre after the trial concluded. His wife, Nora, had prepared a meal. He ate it and went to bed early. He slept well. It was the first time in 2 years he had slept well, and he recognized that fact and felt something about it that was complicated and that he did not have words for, which was unusual for a man who had spent 30 years teaching language and history. Patrice Hollowell, Elaine's friend from Cascade Street, attended every day of the trial. She sat in the third row, left section, same seat each day. She was described by a journalist who covered the proceedings as a woman in her mid-40s with the expression of someone watching something they refused to look away from. When the verdict was read, she did not react visibly. She remained in her seat after the courtroom cleared for approximately 10 minutes, while the benches emptied around her and the court officers moved through the space, doing the small procedural tasks that follow the end of large proceedings. Then she stood, put on her coat, and walked out into the Cutbank afternoon. Flat gray sky, smell of coming snow, wind from the northwest. The dry grass of the median on the main street bent uniformly southward, and she walked home. She made spaghetti bolognese for dinner that night. She opened a bottle of wine. She had to try 3 times to pull the cork, because her hands, which had been perfectly steady all day, had decided, now that no one was watching, to shake. She poured a glass. She thought about the hug at the door on Cascade Street, cedar soap. She drank the wine. She ate the pasta. She did not call anyone. She simply sat at her kitchen table in the dark, in the specific silence that follows the resolution of something that cannot, properly speaking, be resolved at all. On the Two Medicine limestone shelf, the natural depression in the stone where Elaine Rourke had lain, left by the combination of her weight and the wax's sealing of organic material to the surface over many months, slowly filled with wind-blown pine needles over the following winters. By the autumn of 2022, it was not visible unless you knew exactly where to look and got down on your hands and knees to look for it. The gooseberry canes at S7, 2 miles to the southwest, continued their seasonal cycle unremarked. The maintenance track by the lake remained open. The mountains did not change. Bonnie Tull retired from the Glacier County Sheriff's Office on February 28, 2023, after 21 years of service. At her retirement gathering, held in the department's conference room with grocery store cake and non-alcoholic punch, she was given a commendation by the county sheriff for her work on the Rourke case. She accepted it with a brief, appropriate remark. In her speech, 2 minutes, no notes, she did not use the words justice or closure. She said that the work of her career was not the solving of cases, but the practice of attention, and that she hoped the people coming after her would continue to pay attention to the things that could not speak for themselves. She took the photograph of the unidentified mountain range from her office wall. She had still never identified it. She put it in her car and drove home. On the day she retired, no one claimed responsibility for it, and the sheriff's office did not investigate, left a small jar of raw beeswax on the shelf outside her office door. Not from any hive she could trace, not labeled, just a small jar, pale gold in the fluorescent light of the hallway. She looked at it for a moment. Then she left it where it was and walked out into the Montana winter. 7 words scratched in concrete. The patient arithmetic of days marked in groups of 5. A woman who counted each one and left her name in the wall when she was done. My name is Elaine. I was here. She was. Gerald Owen Pruitt is incarcerated at Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge, Montana. He has not appealed his sentence. He is eligible for his first parole review in 2046, at which time he will be 74 years old. The Glacier County Sheriff's Office closed case 18-CR-4471 on May 15, 2021. It required 947 days and 7 words to close it. The High Plains Botanical Conservancy resumed field surveys at Site S7 in the summer of 2022. The lead field researcher made the first notation in the new survey log in Elaine Rourke's field methodology format: date, Timeliin, Chi, time, GPS coordinate, species name, sample designation, because Dr. Wexler had asked that it be done that way. The gooseberry canes were healthy, the samples were good. Dorothea Rourke still pays the monthly fee on Elaine's phone number. She will continue to do so, she has said, until she cannot.
The story of Claire Maddox is a rare case where a disappearance in the mountains doesn't end with the discovery of a body. It ends with a return. But that doesn't make the story any easier. On the contrary, it becomes even more unsettling because it shows that sometimes a person can be very close to roads, houses, and people and still be completely unreachable. The most remarkable thing about this story is not just that Claire survived, but how she survived. She observed, memorized, and built a map of the world using sounds, light, and directions. Even in the basement, she remained herself, a botanist, a person who knows how to notice details. And it was precisely these details that helped her escape. The investigation ended with a conviction. The perpetrator was sentenced. But the main thing here is not him. The main thing is Claire, who one day walked into the forest again and kept going, not because she was no longer afraid, but because she reclaimed her right to her own life. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and write in the comments which moment you found the most powerful. Thank you for being with me.